Korea attacked South Korea at the dawn of June 25th, 1950.
The Soviet Union was behind the attack, and they had to arm the North Koreans.
The armistice has prevented any major outbreak of hostilities.
One great thing is that South Korea has become a vibrant democracy with a very good economy.
The North's desire to replace the armistice with something more permanent, I think, reflects their continued anxieties.
And it took 7 weeks for them to return. Why the delay?
There's a transactional nature. We expect them to do us a favor. They expect us to do one in return.
I think there'll be a certain amount of aid if we can ever get to a real denuclearization.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eunjang Cho. 65 years ago, on July 27th, the Korean War armistice was signed. It's the war that never formally ended and still takes center stage in diplomatic talks surrounding the Korean Peninsula. Today, we take a look at the implications of the Korean War to this day. Now my guest today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining us today, Dr. Lawrence Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Dr. Korb served as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be with you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Let me begin from here. North Korea attacked South Korea at the dawn of June 25th, 1950. Why did the United States decide to get involved in this war?
Well, I think the reason was that we knew that the then Soviet Union was behind the attack, and they had to arm the North Koreans and encourage them to do that because the United States had said we wouldn't defend it. And I think this was really the beginning of the containment strategy against the Soviet Union to say, where we ended in World War II, we're going to fight if you go past any of those lines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how was American value reflected in this fighting? I'm thinking of words like liberty, democracy, justice, freedom.
Well, I think the fact of the matter was this was a question of your interest trumping your values, because South Korea, not like it is now, was not a democracy then. So it really wasn't a fight for freedom. It was really to make sure that the Soviet Union and then their allies in China did not advance.
I think Dr. Korb makes a very important point here. You know, Mike Mansfield wrote his master's thesis on the U.S.-Korea diplomatic history right up until the Japanese colonial period. And the conclusion he reached there was that, well, you know, the United States maybe didn't have sufficient strategic interests at stake to push back against Japanese colonial occupation of Korea. But in the Cold War context, that was what the driver was. And were it not for the general U.S. fear of Soviet expansionism, I don't think we ever would have become engaged in defense of the Korean people against this North Korean aggression.
No, in fact, Secretary of State Acheson had given a speech and said the line goes from Japan through Taiwan, to the Philippines. So, in effect, we had given what the Soviets thought was a green light to do it.
We were talking about this interest to get involved in the war. Then why did the United States decide to end it in a truce?
Well, I think we recognized that once the Chinese came in, that in fact we could not win without sending hundreds of thousands more troops, and we wanted to send them to Europe at the time, or even use nuclear weapons. And so the idea was we're back to where before the war started, so we can claim that that is a victory.
And the facts on the ground meant that continuing the war was going to be futile, but they also suggested that ending the war with a peace treaty would be to enshrine and legitimize the North Korean state and the South Korean state as they were, which had not been the original international concept. At the end of World War II, there was the hope and expectation that the Korean people would have a plebiscite and there would be unification. So I think the truce also represented a kind of a halfway measure. Let's stop fighting, but let's leave open the possibility of a diplomatic settlement that would go beyond where a peace treaty might take us. A peace treaty, I think, in the views of the United States and probably also on the side of the North Koreans and the Chinese, would lock in the status quo.
Looking back 65 years from then, what are the achievements and positive results from the truce?
Well, I think the one great thing is that South Korea has become a vibrant democracy with a very good economy. Their people are doing well. We have basically split off China from the Soviet Union, which helped end the Cold War.
Yeah, both North and South were given the opportunity to develop in relative peace, and the armistice has prevented any major outbreak of hostilities, and it's created a greater sense of security for people North and South. But I think what we're seeing now is that armistice agreement never has provided the North with quite the same measure of security that maybe the U.S. alliance provided to the South. And the North's desire to replace the armistice with something more permanent, I think, reflects their continued anxieties about the impermanence of this armistice agreement.
The Korean War is the forgotten war, and people went to the land they never knew. How is the recent North Korean nuclear threat shedding new light on the Korean War?
Well, there's no doubt about it, because after the Korean War, which did not end the way we thought to have, quote unquote, a victory, then of course we got involved in Vietnam, and we sent 500,000 troops to Vietnam, and that lasted a lot longer. And so people focused on that in terms of the sacrifices that the men and women who fought in those wars undertook, and then of course the end of the Cold War. So basically it became forgotten because it sort of ended in a stalemate, and then we moved on.
The Vietnam War, as Dr. Korb says, I mean, the Vietnam War was this traumatic event for the American people, and we debated it, and in the course of that debate, there was a learning process about Vietnam, its people, its history. But Korean War really was never the controversial subject back home, and because it didn't end with fanfare and success and parades, there was a reluctance even, I think, by many in the United States to talk about it. And when veterans came home, I think they also were very quiet about their experience, which had been in many cases, I mean, horrific suffering and really an arduous, difficult combat. So it's good that people are beginning to learn a little bit more about Korea now, but I worry a little that our leaders are not doing a very good job of really bringing forward the lessons that we should have learned from the Korean War.
Right. So the Korean War was the first major conflict of the Cold War, but now we're in the age of tyrants and terrorists. I got this phrase from Dr. Korb's book. And so how should the U.S. role change from then to now to preserve peace in the international community?
Well, I think basically what you're really concerned about is what we call terrorist or attacks rather than a large-scale invasion. I mean, I can't imagine North Korea invading South Korea again, or the Russians invading Eastern Europe. Cyber warfare, terrorist attacks, that's what you have to worry about these days.
And in that struggle, the advantage we have now is at least we have the potential for the former Cold War adversaries to work together. So, the six-party process on the Korean Peninsula was designed to bring the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans, the Japanese, South Koreans all together in the peace process. And hopefully that is the future of the post-Cold War world, is one in which the U.S. and former adversaries like China or Russia in the Soviet days can actually work together to address some of these unconventional threats.
Right. Mr. Jannuzi mentioned about the veterans, and I met with the Korean War veterans this week, and they were very interested in this possible talks on possibly forging a peace treaty with North Korea, but they say that this should be a very slow and prudent process. Why do you think they are so interested in this process?
Well, you know, the Korean War veterans are likely to be the champions of peace, just as the Vietnam War veterans were among the vanguard trying to normalize relations with Vietnam. But they also, because they know the Korean people and they fought and died on the Korean Peninsula, they know that nothing comes easy in Korea. So I hope the President will listen to the veterans' voices, because that slow, step-by-step process that is likely to be necessary to forge peace is one the veterans know from fighting foot by foot, hilltop to hilltop on the peninsula. Nothing came easily there, and it's not likely to come easily this time around in terms of the peace process.
Mm-hmm. North Korea started dismantling the missile test site at Dongchangri, and North Korea is pushing the United States to make some progress towards declaring the end of the war. What the dismantling of the Dongchangri, is it worthy of such reaction from the United States?
Well, I think the United States ought to end the war even without any concessions, because it's not anything we're giving up. For all practical purposes, the war has ended, but by formally ending it, in effect, you're saying to North Korea, we're not going to invade you, we're not going to say you're an illegitimate country, which we haven't. I mean, the fact of the matter is that really is not only good for them, good for us, and we really don't need anything. It's not like in terms of relaxing the sanctions, for example.
Right. I mean, if we were to end the war, I think the only stipulations the American side would really want to make is that we're not in any way legitimizing North Korea as a nuclear state.
Right.
But we've already announced that we have no intention to overthrow their government, to invade. There's no preference for the use of military force. No one wants to start the war again. So if you look at the Singapore Declaration, those first three paragraphs, the first is sort of, end the war, and then, make peace and normalize relations, and then denuclearization. I don't think you can put everything in that order. I think there's going to have to be some simultaneous steps. But I think that accelerating the peace process deprives the North of the excuse they have to cling to their nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. Well, last question before you go. I mean, declaration to end the war is one thing, but when North Korea has not fully denuclearized, should we forge a peace treaty with North Korea and rush into this?
Well, again, I think you can do the peace treaty, but basically you still have to work on the nuclear issue. It's a separate issue. The peace treaty, you end the war, and as Frank said, you give them a certain amount of legitimacy. But the nuclear thing, there is a non-proliferation treaty which they signed. And so that's what you really got to hold them to. And that's why the international community, not just the United States, has put those sanctions on them. And so that's your card there, is the sanctions to try and get them to denuclearize.
We'll end this discussion here and watch video for our next discussion.
Thousands of service members who are unaccounted for. We have suspended that effort.
North Korea handed over 55 cases of remains of the U.S. soldiers killed during the Korean War. This will be the start of a long process, with 5,300 American service members' remains believed to be in North Korea. Now, when President Trump met with Chairman Kim, they agreed to immediately repatriate the remains that North Korea already identified, which was 200 cases, and it took 7 weeks for them to return. Why the delay?
Well, look, the North Koreans have many reasons to slow walk this process. For one thing, the U.S. desire to get these remains back is well known to them, and it has a value attached to it. And so, although it's sort of distasteful to think of it in these terms, there's a transactional nature to almost everything we do with North Korea. And if we expect them to do us a favor, they expect us to do one in return. And it was very unclear what, if any, favors the Trump administration was prepared to put on the table. What I would like to see us do is to get beyond this transactional nature of the North Koreans handing over remains and us, taking some modest step, and really get back to where we used to be, which was joint recovery missions with U.S. soldiers and North Korean soldiers working on the ground together inside North Korea to recover the remains. Instead of a transaction, it should be a relationship.
And I think it's very important for us to get them back because the military has a motto, leave no soldier behind. And this is very critical. I mean, we're not fought, but we've been still working with the Vietnamese to get back the men and women who died there. And the fact that in Korea we didn't really get anything until very recently, this is very, very important. I just hope the North Koreans don't say, oh, we know it's so important to the United States, maybe we can get something. It's important to us because this is who we are.
You've talked about the transactional nature, and from 1996 to 2005, when this joint survey was underway, United States paid North Korea $28 million. Do you think another lump sum of money will go to North Korea?
Just to clarify, I mean, those payments were in essence, to compensate the North for expenses incurred in the recovery operations, including disruption of farming by the North Korean people or transportation and fuel and those kinds of issues. So I think it's not inappropriate that the United States provided some compensation, but I agree very strongly a better way to do it is essentially with reciprocal humanitarian gestures. The North Koreans would undertake this recovery operation at their own expense as a humanitarian issue, and we would perform comparable humanitarian gestures for the North Korean people inside North Korea. Even if we send our soldiers there, they could build wells or do health screening and other kinds of work while they're inside the country. I think that would be a better formula.
From 1996 to 2005, 630 cases of U.S. soldiers' remains were returned to the United States, and out of them, 330 were identified as U.S. soldiers, only half of them. So what is telling about this? What would be the pitfalls of us cooperating with North Korea in this issue?
Well, you want to keep your expectations in check, I think, is the main thing. For the families of the fallen, every remain that comes home is a godsend and a blessing and a comfort. But those 55 casks of remains, it's possible that none of them are United States soldiers. They could be other NATO combatants. Not NATO, I'm sorry, other UN combatants, or Chinese soldiers, or North Korean soldiers, or South Korean soldiers. So probably we will never get full accounting.
And what we're doing to the extent that we can is getting DNA from people who are related to these men who fought in the war. And again, we need to accelerate that because given the passage of time, there may not be many of them still alive.
Well, we'll end this discussion here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today is taken at Pyongyang's Munsu Water Park this week. This water park is a popular entertainment facility for people in capital Pyongyang. Scorching heat gripped parts of Asia, and North Korea was no exception. Temperatures reached record highs in many regions in North Korea, close to 104 degrees. Frank, what's your reaction?
Well, it's been hot here too, and the fact that the North Korean elite in Pyongyang have a place to escape is comforting for them, I'm sure. But most North Koreans don't have swimming pools around, so. A reminder to me of the disparate lifestyle of the capital city dwellers and the rest of the country.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is not typical of North Korea. It might be typical of some people in the capital, but if you go to that country and see, outside of Pyongyang, how bad it is for the people, it's nothing like this.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Korb, Mr. Jannuzi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Thank you for watching.